Good morning, everyone, again. Go ahead and turn over to 1 Kings chapter 17. That's where we're, well, not really going to begin. I'm going to do a little quick recap, but that's where we'll start reading in a few moments here. So last week we started a new study. I've coined it as the life and times of Elijah and Elisha. Kind of last week we talked more about the times. This week we'll talk more about the life. I wanted to kind of lead up and contextualize the world in which Elijah first appears on the scene. Chapter 17 of 1 Kings is where we first see him, but I wanted to spend a good amount of time building up to, what is he getting himself into? What is going on when Elijah first appears? Maybe give us some thoughts as to why God is sending Elijah, and perhaps Elijah in particular. So last week we talked a lot about the era of the divided kingdom leading up to this time. After Solomon's reign, Solomon, of course, is the son of David. David was successor to Saul, who was the first king of Israel. After Solomon's reign came to an end, after he died, his son Rehoboam became king. But the kingdom divided during his reign, the very beginning of his reign. Of course, this was foretold. We have Rehoboam, who loses pretty much all of Israel except for the tribes of Judah and Benjamin in the south. So from here on out, when I say the kingdom of Judah, I mean those southern two tribes, that southern kingdom. And when I refer to Israel, it's the other 10 tribes in the northern side that I'm referring to. The northern side, of course, allied with Jeroboam, who had been an official in Solomon's court, I guess would be the way we would say it. He had fled Egypt when Solomon tried to put an end to him potentially taking the throne. And there's a whole story about that. We kind of just touched on it, but you can read about it in your own time. I won't get into much more detail this morning. But Jeroboam becomes king of the northern kingdom. Again, the 10 northern tribes. And the first thing he decides to do is state-sponsored religion in some golden calves, which, if you remember back in Exodus, doesn't work out very well. And this is something that is going to be a problem throughout the entire rest of the existence of the northern kingdom. He sets up one in Bethel and one in Dan. A little bit of irony there is he sets one up in Bethel, the name of the city is literally the house of God. But now he's put a golden calf there. And his reason was purely political. He was afraid people would go down to Jerusalem to do all the sacrifices and all the worshiping that they do there, which is in the southern kingdom. And he was afraid, well, if they do that, their hearts are going to go back to Rehoboam. I'm going to not just lose my kingdom, but I'm probably going to get killed also, is the implication there. So he sets up the idols purely for this reason. There doesn't seem to be any indication that he really believes that, yeah, these are the real gods. This is, I want to be in power and I don't want to lose that power. Jeff, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just thought I'd mention the fact that you remember during the days of, I believe it was the days of the judges, Dan did not fully conquer their territory they were given, and about half of the tribe went north of the land allotted for Israel and found a town that was defenseless and killed all the people there and set up idol worship there. And said throughout the time of Israel they worshipped idols up there. So it was very fitting when Jeroboam came in and brought in the idols, because they had been very used to them in Dan, at least.
Yeah, well, and of course, going back to Exodus, where they made the golden calf then, this is not the first time that Israel has dabbled in this. Of course, they probably got that idea from the Egyptians. So when we see this idol worship, it's not because God has given them this idea, it's that they get it from somewhere else. And we'll talk about that quite extensively probably throughout this study, is they acquire these idols from other nations. And that was part of the reason God had told them to wipe out the Canaanites who were in that land, was they had come to this point of sin so much that it wasn't necessarily the Israelites were so righteous and great, even though God had made his promise with Abraham. It was also to get rid of these wicked people. Not unlike the reason that Babylon came in and took out the southern kingdom of Judah in generations to come. God will use other groups and other people to inflict his justice upon the wicked. And we see that over and over again. Judges is actually a really good example of that too. Where God will use not necessarily righteous or good moral people to do things, against people who are messing up. So I probably didn't word that super well, but I think you all know what I mean by that. We also kind of talked about the kings in the northern kingdom up to this point. Jeroboam, he had his son take over the throne when he died, but he was betrayed by one of his officials who killed him and took over, coup d'etat style. And then his son becomes king, and then his son is deposed by one of his officials, and then he gets deposed by another person. So it's very very fractured, very very dangerous to be king in Israel. And this is not. It's going to be kind of the same lineage for a while at times, but toward the end of the Northern Kingdom, it's going to happen again, where you have people assassinate another guy, and he takes over, and then he gets assassinated, and his assassin takes over. It's very very dangerous to be king in the Northern Kingdom, because there's not so much any respect for the king or the lineage of which they come from. So we talked about last week, because we're going to be, at least when we start this study, largely in the reign of King Ahab. Now, King Omri was his father who preceded him, and he had taken out another guy to become king, but that guy had taken out another guy to become king, so it was fully justified. He had also had to fight another guy off who tried to take the kingship from him. Again, very violent times. But it says about King Omri in chapter 16 that he was more wicked than all the kings before him, and all the kings of Israel up to that point had all been described as doing evil in the eyes of the Lord. So a very high threshold to be the most wicked king. And then immediately after that, toward the end of chapter 16, we see Ahab becoming king of Israel. And it says he was more wicked than all the kings before him, which means his father, who was more wicked than all the kings who were already all wicked, Ahab is even worse. So Ahab is the worst king. He's the absolute worst, and that's in literal terms. He's the absolute worst. We could probably make arguments that there were worser kings later. Ahab is pretty bad. We're going to get a lot of descriptions of Ahab and his rule. Part of his problem was, of course, his marriage to Jezebel, which her name has become an insult because of the life and character that she had. She is not an Israelite. She is a daughter of the king of Sidon, and she brings with her, say it with me, idol worship. Like I said, they're bringing it from other places. She brings in the Baals, and Ahab basically makes Baal a state-sponsored religion in Israel. So it's not just that there's idol worship going on, it's that the king himself is, and literally he's building temples in Samaria. We read about that at the end of chapter 16. He builds a temple for Baal in Samaria. So it's not just he's just letting it go on, he's not clamping down on it, he's endorsing it, full stop. There's nothing he's holding back as far as that goes. There's also the Asherah poles that are going on. They don't get as much focus. Baal's going to be most of the focus as far as the idol worship going on in this time. And it also talks about Ahab following the sins of Jeroboam. This is what is basically said about every king of Israel, and we talked about this phrase last week. It means that they are going into that side of idol worship. They are not paying attention to the word of the Lord. They're not caring about the prophets. They're doing their own thing. Basically, that's what you see for every king of Israel. Talk about they followed in the ways of Jeroboam or the sins of Jeroboam. That's what they're referring to. We see that over and over again. And this is the world that Elijah steps into, and God tells him, okay, it's time to do some work. Sometimes we don't take jobs because it seems too much. We're like, I don't really want to tackle that. I'll leave that for someone else. Elijah is tackling that. He's going to have a lot of interesting conversations with God later on. We'll get to those as we go, but this is the time that Elijah is coming into for his tenure as a prophet. At least as far as we see, we don't see anything earlier of him. It's possible he was doing stuff before, quite possible, but we're going to see him for the first time in chapter 17, which we'll read in just a second. Unless anyone has any comments or anything we want to add before we get in. I think I went over this stuff pretty deeply last week, so I just wanted to recap for those who may not hear it and recall. Okay. All right, so let's get into it for realsies. someone read for us, we're just going to do the first verse. Someone read 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 1, please.
And Elijah the Tishbite of the inhabitants of Gilead said to Ahab, as the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years except at my word.
Okay, so he's just here. We don't get a huge build-up to Elijah like we do with Ahab. And Ahab is going to be kind of a main focus for a time here. In fact, Ahab is going to have kind of a journey, I'd like to say comparable, not dissimilar to the kind of the things that happened to Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. The only difference is Ahab doesn't really get it like Nebuchadnezzar eventually does. At least I don't think so. That's not the way I see it. But just Elijah's here. So what do we know about him? Well, we know that he's a Tishbite. So he's from Tishbe, which is a place in the area of Gilead. And Gilead, of course, is on the east side of the Jordan River. It's a hill country, good for grazing, animal pasture land, that kind of stuff. That's it. We don't really know his family too much, except, he's a Tishbite, so he's probably related to people from there. We don't know how old he is when he starts this. We really don't know anything about him. I don't know. I like to know more, but I don't. But he's going to be very important. He's going to be kind of the person we're going to follow for a good chunk of this study here. But we don't really know much about him. The Bible doesn't say much about him in the way that others in this time period are described. But we're given what we need to know. And that's really more what he does rather than who he is the important thing. We get enough information. Know he's an Israelite, that he does serve God. That's all evident. That's all easy to understand. But aside from that, his actions, the things he does, the things he says, these are more important, and that's what the focus is on. So, what does he do here in this first verse? Oh, okay. Yeah, well, and then maybe, there's a reason that God is sending kind of a nobody from the backcountry to straighten out Ahab, who may think he's all that, too. So we might see a little bit of conflict there just because of that. But going back to his actions here in verse 1, what does Elijah do? Okay, and he says it to who is probably the bigger thing. So he says it to Ahab. So he says to Ahab, there's not going to be any rain, basically until I say so. That's basically all of verse 1. Now, I have way more to say about that, because of course I do. Because we have to think about, where is Ahab going to be? It says he says it to Ahab. It doesn't really give any further description of that, but if we assume that Ahab is in the royal palace, that would be in the city of Samaria. Of course, Samaria was turned into the capital during the reign of Omri, Ahab's father, formerly been in Tirzah before that, but Omri created a new capital in Samaria, and presumably that's where Ahab is when Elijah gives this message. Now, we don't know that for sure because it does not say, but since it is Elijah seeming to be the one traveling, he seems to be the one on the road here, he probably is going to Samaria. That's not a for sure thing. Ahab could have been out in the field doing something. We don't know. But it's a good chance he's gone to Samaria. Now, Samaria is not on the east side of the Jordan. It's on the west side. So if this is the case, he is not just going around the corner, to say hi to Ahab and tell him this news. He's traveling a bit of a distance, probably a couple days' journey to get there, and crossing the river, probably. So he's going way out of his way The Lord is not sending someone who is necessarily nearby at this point. So he goes to him and says, there's going to be no rain, and a lot of translations, I think it'll say neither dew nor rain, which is probably even more significant because we can have no rain for a while, but you might have like morning dew, and not everything's going to die in the heat. During a time of less precipitation, but even that's not going to happen. So there's the very important detail there. Now, this is at the direction of the Lord that Elijah is claiming to serve the Lord in this verse. He's doing it in the name of the Lord. This is not just Elijah being mean to Ahab. This is Elijah telling Ahab, this is God's will. This is what God is doing. Now, this is important because we also need to kind of think about why God is picking this punishment in particular. Now, think about all the things that God could do. He could send a plague, sickness, disease, swarm of locusts, send their enemies after them. There's all these things that God could do. Hail from the sky. Pick your poison, I guess, is the phrase we would use. But God does this particular one for a reason. God is not random in this. He doesn't do anything without purpose. If you remember, some of you were here last week, do you remember when I talked about Baal in detail, what Baal was the deity of in the culture of the Phoenicians? The three big ones, and it's one of those things that any false deity always has like his hands in a bunch of different stuff. But the three big ones are fertility, weather, and storms. So those last two, of course, this is going to be in direct contradiction to Baal. God is not just picking some random punishment, says, you're all being bad, y'all need to come back. He's saying, I'm going to do this punishment, and it's going to be in direct contradiction with this false god that you are now worshiping. Because your false god is not going to bring any rain. They're not going to bring any storms. I'm going to prevent that. I'm going to prove to you that this God is nothing, that he is a false god and you should be following me. Now, we're going to get another much clearer indication of that at the scene in Mount Carmel. We're a little bit off from that. We're not getting that today. But God is already placing the foundations for undermining Baal worship, is that there's going to be, in fact, 3 years of drought. Chapter 18 is going to tell us that it's been about 3 years until the situation on Mount Carmel happens. So if you can imagine 3 years of no rain. I don't know how many of you don't irrigate your lawn, but the last couple of weeks where we haven't had, we had some rain recently, but before that we had about a week and a half and pretty much no rain. It was really hot. It was really sunny, and my lawn turned completely brown. Now imagine 3 years of that. That's the situation that's going to be going through all of chapter 17. Is there's going to be no rain, no dew, nothing, in complete, I guess, as a contest to Baal to show that he is completely powerless. And this is why Elijah is making this proclamation, I think, to the king himself. If you just had no rain or something like that, they could say, well, we're just not serving Baal hard enough. We need to be doing more Baal worship. But Elijah is making the point and showing them that this is not about the fact that you're not doing enough. It's that you're doing any. You shouldn't be doing this. You should be serving the Lord. So it's to basically tell the king and the people, this is why this is happening. Don't take this as a sign that you need to get more into the Baal worship, because it could be very easy for them to justify that. Let's see. I think that's all the details on verse 1. Any comments, any other thoughts on verse 1? We're going to hopefully get a little farther. Jeff?
There is a term that they use for the dew in Israel. We see these shepherds leading the herds of sheep in this rocky, barren land, and we wonder how in the world can sheep find any grass. Well, over there, I understand there's a term for it. I can't remember it. The dew falls, and there is an organism that grows in the dew in just the few And, of course, that would have special meaning to Elijah because he's from Gilead. It would still have a lot, it would still greatly affect, especially the shepherds, but it would affect the whole nation in a very extreme way.
Yeah, a lot of the economy is built off of grazing animals. I mean, even if you're not you yourself a shepherd or anything like that, you probably depend on them having a livelihood and being able to sell their meat or wool or whatever in order for the economy to run and your business to thrive as well. So the same is going to be for farmland. If you don't have any water, you're not going to be able to grow anything. And we're going to see when we get to chapter 18, and it may take us a couple weeks to get there, but the situation's really bad by the time we get to chapter 18. I mean, it's going to be, we're going to kind of see it progress as we go through 17, but by 18, it's going to be very clear that things are really, really bad. And not having dew is extremely, I mean, that itself could have been enough. I mean, obviously the rain is probably a bigger, more easy thing to see and detect, but not having dew is extremely amazing because you consider where the location is. They're right next to the Mediterranean Sea. They get a lot of, because I live in California, I kind of know this stuff. As long as the wind is blowing your direction, it's going to blow some of that ocean spray. It's probably not the right term I should use, but you're going to get humidity. You're going to get particulates of water. That's where the dew is coming from, but that's not going to be there. Somehow God is preventing that from happening. Of course, this is all miraculous, but this is something that is impossible, but also is in contradiction to the God they're serving. So God is doing a whole lot here with just this one punishment. He's very specifically targeting them in this way. I just wanted to make that point clear. It's not just God, picking it out of a hat and saying, "Oh yeah, okay, drought. That sounds like a good one." He's very deliberate in using this specifically. Let's move on here. I want to get at least this next part. So I'm going to read for us 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 2 through 6, please. Okay, so depending on your Bible publisher, some of them will put a break after verse 1, some of them won't. I think maybe some publishers are under the impression that perhaps there was a space of time in between verses 1 and 2. Maybe. If there was, though, it was probably not very long. I kind of imagine like this has happened within the last 24 hours between each of these verses. I don't imagine that Elijah is going to be just sticking around hanging out with Ahab after saying this. You're bringing a bad message, and you're a servant of the Lord, so you're automatically an enemy of the state. So I don't think a very long time has occurred between this. I just want to bring that up because I have seen Bibles put a break between it and have like a separate heading. I think this is kind of all happening all at once. I don't think there's a lot of time here in between. If there is, it's probably very short. I say probably within moments of him saying this, God is telling him, okay, here's not what you need to do now. So after Elijah proclaims to King Ahab there's going to be no rain, no dew upon the land, the Lord tells Elijah to go to the Kerith ravine and take refuge there. Just short things about the Kerith ravine. It says here it's east of the Jordan, so if he's come from Gilead to come to Samaria to tell Abraham, God's basically telling him, okay, now go back where you came from. Go to the other side of the Jordan again. So, again, if this is all happening in a very short span of time, he is going to be crossing, at least east to west, the majority of Israel within a very short amount of time. So he is moving. And I bring this up now because a lot of what Elijah does is move from place to place. And sometimes he is on the move for a very significant amount of time. And, he's not, really in a safe place or a place where people would normally want to reside, this one included. So this is not out of the ordinary. This is kind of a trend. This this is Elijah's life here. This is what he does. But I wanted to bring that up. We have just a few verses. He seems to be traveling a lot, even though we're not told exactly where he came from, point A to B. That would be my understanding. That would be my best guess if we had to make a guess. So he goes to the Kirith Ravine. This is a place that is, it's in the wilderness. It's not a populated area. Of course, when you have ravines and stuff, it's hard to build on top of those mountainous crevasse areas. Usually you want sort of flat or sort of easy to build on area. This is not one of those places. It's not in a populated area. I want to say God's purpose right now, at least for Elijah, for the majority of chapter 17, is to just keep him alive and safe. Elijah's going to get his big moments later when we get to chapter 18 and so on. But right now, he's just trying to keep Elijah alive and safe. Now, keeping him isolated away from populated areas is a very simple way of doing that, because surely Ahab and Jezebel really don't like him and like to see him dead. In fact, in chapter 18, we're going to see kind of more about what's been happening in the world of Israel since Elijah isolates himself when he has a conversation with Obadiah, a different Obadiah than the other Obadiah, I think. There's a lot of Obadiahs in the Bible. But this is God's purpose right now. He's going to keep him safe, keep him alive, keep him isolated, and for a time, at least in this ravine. So, in fact, he's going on a little bit of a God-ordained camping trip, if you will. Now, we don't know of any supplies or anything that he has with him. My indication, or the way I read it, is he has absolutely nothing with him. The clothes on his back, that's probably about it. It doesn't indicate that he actually has any kind of tent or shelter he's lugging around with him. And probably another reason he's in this ravine is it will shadow him from the oppressive heat. Since there's not going to be rain, you don't have to worry about that. But to kind of give him some kind of shelter, he's having him go to this ravine. So he's going to be in isolation here for a time. And God informs Elijah that everything's going to be fine. Even this is not a populated place. It's a wilderness area. There's not going to be easy provisions there. God is going to provide for him there. He says he's going to be able to, Elijah will sustain himself in this ravine by drinking from the brook there. And God is going to send ravens to supply him with food. So that's God's plan here. That's basically where we are at the end of verse 4. So verse 5 and 6 is what Elijah actually does after receiving these instructions. Now, the way I read this text is that Elijah does not question anything. He doesn't comment on, hey, this sounds like a bad idea. He just does it. He just goes and does what God says. In later verses, Elijah and God are going to have a lot of very in-depth conversation. Now, I don't know if it's just at this point or this particular moment that Elijah's not doing that, or if it's just not written down for us here. We don't know. It's very, God says and he does it, which is fine, but I almost say it's out of character because Elijah really does have serious conversations with God that are quite extensive later on. And it could be just that in those times Elijah got more discouraged, and so he had to talk to God a little bit more. That's kind of how I see it. I don't think he's having the same kind of questions he has later on, at least not yet. But that's how it's written. I just wanted to bring that up in case someone says, well, there's pages missing from this Bible, because there should be a conversation here where Elijah says, hey, God, this ravine, this is a lousy ravine. Give me another ravine. Something like, that happens a lot in the Bible, but not here. He goes and he does it, and he basically does what he's told. So we see here in verse 6, indeed, Elijah is able to sustain himself in this ravine as exactly as God told him. Imagine that. You do what God says, and God follows through exactly as he says. So Elijah is able to drink from the brook. I don't really have much to say about the brook except, in later verses I will. And these ravens are bringing Elijah, it says, both bread and meat in the morning and the evening. So 2 times a day he's getting some kind of sustenance. Now, I want to talk about real quick before I get to too much detail about the bread and meat itself, about the nature of gifting. Some of you may know about this, others may not, but I want to talk about it a little bit. The avians such as crows, ravens, magpies, those in that family, have been documented to, and it's well known that they will practice something that's sometimes called gifting. So like if you had crows or something in your backyard and you started going out and giving them food, it's not an uncommon thing for them to bring you a gift in return for that food. So you go out and you feed them, and they get to know you for a while. Eventually, they'll start bringing you stuff like shiny stones, buttons, coins, sticks, bones, just random stuff. They'll give you things. This is a natural thing that these kind of birds do, which is really cool. I mean, it shows kind of the intelligence of reciprocating and knowing that, hey, this is a friend and I can get a benefit out of this. It's a cool thing to do. You can, if you find some birds like that, you can try it for yourself and see what random stuff they bring you. But I wanted to dispel any idea that this is what's going on here. Because as far as we see in the text, Elijah is not giving them anything. He's getting everything, and it's not him feeding them, they're feeding him. So this is not, this is something that the birds would be capable of, but this is not in their nature to do. God is doing something miraculous here. Some would say that, oh, Elijah's just really good with birds. He's a cool bird guy. He knows his birds, and this is what he's doing to stay alive. No, this is God working miraculous here, because Elijah doesn't have anything. Like I said, we have no indication he has anything with him. He has nothing that he could give the birds. There's a drought going on. It's not like he could grow some food for them or find food for them and feed them, because that's their job. They're feeding him. So there are some who kind of look at this and say, oh, it's just the natural gifting thing that these birds do. Yes, but actually no, because this is the other way around, and they're not getting anything in return. So obviously God is having his hand in here, in case anyone had any doubts. Also, how would they know to go find him here in this ravine? I just wanted to dispel any notion that that's what's going on, because I'm sure some would talk about that. It is a thing that those type of birds do, but that's not what's going on here. So I didn't want to get us off track and think that that's what's happening, in case some of you, some of you are probably going to go find some birds now to see if it works. Only some type of birds it works with, so look it up before you just start giving random birds stuff. We're not. I want to talk about the bread and meat here. We're not told exactly what kind of bread this is or what kind of meat this is. We're not even really told how much. We're told ravens, plural, are doing this. We don't know how many ravens. You could calculate how much food could a raven hold in its mouth and fly. You could do that math, but if you don't know how many ravens there are, you can't really do that math. The indication is it's more than one. That's about as far as we can get. So they're giving him these meals twice a day. Again, we don't know how much, but it's apparently enough for him to survive on. Now, probably during this time, Elijah is not doing a ton of physical work. He's just hanging out in this ravine. And we don't know how long he's actually here. We're not told that. Even in later versions, we're not told exactly. I would make a guess that it's probably at least a year, given how the flow of chapter 17 is going to go on later into chapter 18. My guess is about a year. I have nothing to base that off of at all, except for just the way the text flows. So I have no evidence. That's just the way, in my own mind, I think, even though I have no way to say that that's right. So please do not go to your neighbor and talk about how he was in this ravine for a year, because it does not say that. That's just kind of what I think in my head. But it's not a short time, and it's probably at least a certain distance or certain amount of time here. And that's how it's described in chapter 17, which is frustrating. It says sometime later and for some time. It doesn't actually give us numbers of any kind. I don't know why. It frustrates me, because you all know how I like my timelines. I like everything to be exact and orderly. But he is there, and he's getting enough to survive on. So if he's just hanging out, not doing any physical work, you don't need as many calories. This is not one of these things where people can write this off and say, well, obviously there's no way this could happen, because he would never get enough food from these ravens, so he would have died, after a certain amount of time. You don't really need that many calories just to live. You need a lot of calories if you're doing a lot of work, because you're burning those calories. But if he's just hanging out by the brook and just sitting, and I don't know what he's doing. There's not much to do there. But he's probably not doing a lot of physical work. He's not growing anything. He's not trying to catch any food. He's not burning any calories, except for, breathing and letting his circulatory system work. That's about it. So he's not really going to need that much to survive on. So I don't have much to go with that. Just, we're not told those details. Just some thoughts about the amounts. Kind of back to the idea of the bread and the meat. Again, we don't know what kind of bread. I don't think it's anything. I doubt it's like sourdough or something really nice like that. The meat, I have no idea. As far as I know, it could be the ravens going out and killing something and bringing it back. Although I don't know, I have a feeling that God would not send them unclean meats. That doesn't seem like something God would do in this situation. I don't know. We're not told. I'm just going to put it that way. We don't know where this food came from. We're not given that detail. But one thing I do want to talk about is a parallel here between kind of Elijah's situation and the children of Israel back in the Exodus. When they've exited Egypt, exodused Egypt? Sure. They've left Egypt, they're going through the wilderness. They cry out to God and said, it would have been better if we'd stayed in Egypt or something, because now we're out here and we have no food. You probably heard this line a few times if you've gone through Exodus. Do you remember what God did for them, specifically in Exodus chapter 16? What did he send? Manna from heaven. So God sends, it's described as bread from heaven. They don't really know what it is. In fact, that's the word manna means, what is it? That's literally what the word means. So they don't really know, but over and over it's kind of described as something like bread that God has miraculously appeared in the dew of the morning, which he doesn't have in this case, but that's when it would appear in the morning, and they would gather it up for the day. You would gather twice as much if it was the day before the Sabbath, and they were fed on that. And then, of course, that's not good enough, because being fed is not sufficient. They need to have meat, and they have that desire for meat. So God also sends them quail, and the quail would go into the camp. They'd kill the quail and eat the meat. So it's interesting here that Elijah is getting pretty much the same kind of meal. I don't know if it's manna is what he's being given, or if it's quail meat. If I had to make a guess and say, you get one chance to get it right, that's what I would guess. But we don't know that, and we have no indication of that. Especially since there's no dew, I'm not sure how that would work. God would probably make it work. But there's that interesting parallel here where he's getting the same meal that Moses would have had in his time. And kind of a few times in the study, I'm going to point out these parallels between Moses and Elijah, because those parallels also exist in the New Testament. So it's interesting to be kind of going back to the Old Testament, see where they have very similar situations that God is doing very similar things with them, even though they live in very different times. Gretchen, you had your hand up. Go ahead. Locusts. Well, it doesn't seem like there's any of that around for Elijah, at least. If there was, that'd probably be what God would have him do. Remember, again, if you have no rain, even eventually the insects are going to go away, because they need that water too. Everything needs water. That's one of the big things about astronomers, is if they're looking for life on another planet, is there water, or is there the ability for water to exist? And that can go into a whole slurry of things. But like everything needs water. So the fact that there's not going to be any water means that his food sources, or possibility of food sources, is going to go way down. Now he's by this brook, so there may be some things there, but not sufficient enough for him. And this is what God has decided to do. So I don't know. God could have, but that's not what he's doing, I guess. So it's just an interesting parallel. And again, God doesn't do anything randomly. I think there's a reason he's giving him this bread and this meat. Again, I'm going to try to point out as we go along parallels between Moses and Elijah, maybe to prove some bigger point. I haven't decided. But when they come up, I'm going to point them out. Someone go to Psalm 78 real quick. We're going to finish on this. We're about out of time, and I don't want to start the new section and run out of time. And Psalm 78 talks about quite a bit of things, but I want to talk about kind of the poetic way in which it describes the manna and the quail and the people's interaction with it, even though it's kind of couched in this whole thing about how they were sinning a whole bunch. God provided them, and they kept sinning. That's the context of this. Someone read for us, though, Psalm 78, verses 23 through 29, please.
Yet he commanded the skies above and opened the doors of heaven, and he rained down on them manna to eat and gave them the grain of heaven. What number?
Through 29, please.
Man ate of the bread of the angels. He sent them food in abundance. He caused the east wind to blow in the heavens, and by his power he let out the south wind. He rained meat on them like dust, winged birds like the sand of the sea. He let them fall in the midst of their camp, all around their dwellings. And they ate and were filled, for he gave them what they craved.
Okay, so one of the reasons I bring this up, I mean, it's really beautiful writing, first of all. The bread of angels being rained down on people like that. Like, you get real good imagery in there about what it may have looked like. I mean, we get quite a bit of description of it also in Exodus and other places, but this psalm also does a pretty good job of kind of giving you an idea of, like, the quail were just flying into their camp and they just had to go out and get them. It's not like God made it difficult for the Israelites at all in any way. It's a really interesting imagery, and the reason I bring this up also is because it talks about how they had plenty to eat. It's not like they just had enough to get by. They were filled. They had all they wanted. They were not in want at all. And I wonder, because we don't know how much bread and meat Elijah was getting, if this was also the case for him. Was God sending all these ravens just like, huge slabs of meat in their mouths and big slices of bread, and that he just had way more than anyone really needs? We don't know. It's one of those things. I hate when we don't know those things, but it's apparently not a detail we need. But God can provide not just the bare minimum, but an abundance, because this is what the psalm writer describes. I read chapter 17 of 1 Kings, and I think, well, he just gave them enough to get by. But then I also read Psalm 78, and I think he was probably pretty well off. I don't think God is going to make him suffer in this regard and give him, just barely enough, and so he's always kind of hungry, just waiting for the next meal. It also is an interesting thing where they're getting bread in the morning, and the quail come in the evening. That's how Exodus chapter 16 describes it. And of course, the morning, the evening are the times that the bread and meat is brought to Elijah. They seem to be happening, both the bread and meat, both the morning and the evening. So it's not perfectly aligned, but also, again, very, very similar. Go ahead, Arnold. You'll have the last word here.
I just want to say that in Elijah's case, I think, as you say, we don't know the quantity, but we know he was given enough to sustain him. And if we look at Israelites and an abundance, well, in this case, this is a different scenario where things are going down. This is basically what the plague is, or the curse is.
Yeah. And like you said, it's going to get worse. Things are going to get worse. We'll kind of see that as we continue on. In fact, the very next verse, which I'm not going to start today, is going to talk about how that brook that Elijah's drinking from, it's not there anymore. So he's going to have to move on to another place. So this is, and I never know how far to take this because I don't really understand it fully myself. Of course, this is a test and a punishment for the people of Israel, for King Ahab. But Elijah is also kind of getting some learning moments here. I'll call them learning moments, because punishments are probably not the exact word I want to use. He's getting learning moments. And I want to kind of, as we go on, try to see why God is spending so much time with this guy to do these particular things. We'll have a lot more to talk about as we go on, but keep that in mind that this is not just about punishing Israel. This is also about teaching Elijah something. And then we're going to that'll transfer to Elisha when we get to that point, and I'll talk a lot about that as well when we get there. We have a while, but very interesting stuff, very interesting concepts, and very interesting times that they are in. So I'm going to stop there. We'll start verse 7 next week. Verse 7 will be kind of another change in the scenery, and we'll have a lot to talk about there. Some really, really cool stuff happens in the next part of 17.